Good afternoon, Adam. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you, Bassam.
Very good to see you, Habibi. I am excited that we're doing this, especially that we have talked before, and I would love to have your insights be included in this series on what have we learned a year on after Israel's genocide. And you've selected Zionism, United States resistance, the West in quotation marks slash Western values also in quotation marks. That's number four. And finally, responsibility for this genocide. So we'll get into it, and a lot of the material regarding your bio and background will be on the post. So we are going to skip that. This is going to be a bit more concise than other conversations. So let me start with the first question, which I ask everyone. Uh, Besides, how are you? What do you think this particular moment we're living in right now is about? Where are we now? Can you share any thoughts? And these could be personal, they don't have to be analytical or anything like this, or a mix.
Yeah, well, no, well, thank you for including me in this. And that's a great first question. And, one of the things that's interesting about this moment, and we're sort of like, what have we learned over this past year, or looking back over a year of genocide, we're still very much in this moment. This learning is happening as we speak and as we see what is unfolding. So I think it's still difficult to say, like, what is this moment that we're in. I mean, I think in terms of looking at these questions and these topics that we're going to discuss, um, when I think about this last year, I think about it less in terms of what we have learned as much as what it has clarified. There might have been questions that we had before October 7th that now we very much know the answers to, or answers that we might have suspected that we know, that I feel like we have a lot more clarity, and a number of new questions that I think we're going to get into during our conversation. But I mean, this last year has been devastating, and I just look forward to being able to be a part of trying to help understand it and discuss it.
Thank you. Absolutely. We're going to get into the next topic, which is a very dicey topic, not because it's not clear in the objective sense, because you could look at the material written about it by the founding fathers, and they're usually fathers, unless I'm missing some mothers. Um, but it's dicey because there seems to be a serious disagreement from the quote unquote other side, and that is Zionism. We have talked about Zionism in our conversations at length, but right now I'd like you to share with us what have we learned in the past year about Zionism.
Yeah, and so I was lucky enough to join you, I think, twice in this last year, in talking about Zionism and questions of anti-Zionism. And I feel like, in terms of the topics we're talking about today, um, Zionism is really this topic that, for me, has become extremely clear in this last year, and extremely clarified. Um, and by that, I mean, and this is still a conversation that might happen in some of the circles that we move in, or certainly some of the circles on the quote unquote left, or in the Palestine movement generally, around Zionism and questions of liberal Zionism and things like that. But I feel like one of the things the genocide in Gaza has really made clear, and not just in Gaza, but what we've seen throughout historic Palestine, what we've seen in Lebanon, and the rest of the region, is just Zionism very clearly being acted out as a genocidal ideology that needs to be defeated. And one of the moments in this last year that helped clarify this for me, and it was really someone telling this to me, but so, I mean, I'm sure this is in my bio, we might talk about it. I'm managing editor at mondoweiss.net, which is a news website about Palestine and uh, politics and movement around Palestine. And we ran an interview in March with Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta. And one of the things that he talked about in that interview was that one of the things that this has clarified for him is that Zionism is an ideology that needs to be defeated and will only end by being defeated. And I want to share one thing that he said because I found it really interesting, and I've thought about it ever since. And he was sharing it as part of a critique of Palestinians and Palestinian leadership. And he said, you see, the ANC was prepared to negotiate on everything other than the dismantlement of the ideology of apartheid. The failure of the Palestinians to centralize the destruction of Zionism as an ideology, without which there is no possibility of negotiation or coexistence, is now what we're paying the price for. It's a failure to accept the nature of the settler colonial ideology. And I remember when he said that in our interview, and I was really struck by it. But I do think that that is one thing that we have seen play out in this last year, because it's one of the things that we've really seen when we look at Israeli society, is this real consensus around this national project of Zionism, that for all of the disputes or conflict that might exist within Israeli society, there has really been a very clear consensus around the genocide in Gaza and the general militarism and Israel's role in the region. So for all of these questions, and these are questions that still exist, that we see playing out on Twitter and in social media around Zionism and what its role is, I think one of the things this year has really clarified is ultimately that Zionism is an ideology that will have to be defeated before we're able to move on from this moment very fully.
Thanks, Adam. These insights are really important, even if a lot of people listening might, or a certain audience would feel that this is outrageous. Except that there is an actual genocide manifesting, and it is being connected directly, incessantly, to the ideology, and it's there's a recursive sort of relationship there. In all cases, let's move to the next topic, which is very important. And in full disclosure, given that we are recording these a few days before they are broadcast, this is being recorded before the elections. The second topic is the United States. And even though those of us who have been studying the United States, not in the United States only, have had these insights, suspicions, critiques for quite some time. But unless someone is not being honest with themselves, even those of us who are already critical and maybe even somewhat cynical about the reality of the leadership state, government ethos that we are living with or under or in, we were also still a bit surprised the extent to which the United States has gone in the past year in its support of Israel's genocide, in terms of decision-making, policies, arming, as well as style. So all this to say is, what is it that we have learned in the past year about the United States, including what we may not have, thought was possible, or what was really affirmed? Sorry for the long introduction.
No, that was really helpful. And this is also going to dip. So just to say, in my role at Mondoweiss and the role that I've played there, we really see ourselves as this platform for debates across the movement. And so what I'm about to talk about has been sort of one of these central debates in terms of what is the role of the United States when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to the Israeli government. And one of these debates is always focused on the Israel lobby and what is the role in the Israel lobby in terms of helping to determine what U.S. policy is towards Palestine. And one of the things that I feel like this last year has really helped, again, clarify is that, and we're going to be talking later about the responsibility for this genocide, but what we've seen over this past year has been as much of of a U.S. genocide, a U.S. war on Palestine and Palestinians, as it has been an Israeli. There was a statistic that came out just in this past week that over 70% of the weapons that Israel has used to carry out this genocide was provided by the U.S. It was very clear without U.S. support, whether it's military, whether it is the U.S. Standing up for Israel at the UN and in the International Court of Justice and these other places, that Israel would not be able to do what it's doing. And so one of the sort of exercises I've been kind of curious to do, and maybe we will still do, is this sort of thought experiment of, when it comes to the Israel lobby, there's this debate of who is controlling. Is the U.S. being led by the lobby? Is the lobby supporting the U.S.? And so this sort of thought experiment of, well, what would this last year have looked like if the Israel lobby in the United States didn't exist? And I feel strongly that it wouldn't look very different, especially internationally, especially in terms of the way that the U.S. government has supported Israel. I think there's some interesting questions of how it might look different in the United States, where the lobby also plays this really repressive role. But when we look at the U.S. role in helping to carry out the genocide, they have been, a facilitator and a close co-partner with Israel. And it kind of reminds me, and I've had this conversation with a number of people over this last year, and people might be more familiar with this or not, but there's this sort of internet meme that I've seen, that I'm sure many of us have seen online where, and I don't know what television show it's from, but it is these two guys and they're dressed up in Nazi uniforms. And one is leaning over to the other one and saying, "Are we the bad guys?" Like finally kind of figuring out that they are the bad guys in this story. I think that's been the experience of a lot of people in the U.S. over this last year who maybe before this past year felt that the United States played a positive or a peacemaking or a constructive role when it came to Palestine. And this year, it became clear without a shadow of a doubt that the U.S. is helping to arm, facilitate, lead, cheerlead, and support this horrible genocide that we've seen.
Thank you, Adam. There's a lot that we can say, but I appreciate your keeping to time. I have to move to the next one. I'm just gonna move to the next one. Fortunately or unfortunately, the next topic is a topic that is marked with danger, and that's resistance. And I say danger because almost most of the debates occurring today about the question of Israel and Palestine and the genocide that's taking place, or the question of October 7th, or the question of the legitimacy of what's happening, doesn't take resistance seriously, doesn't take the fact that it is actually legal and legitimate according to international law, with the caveat that not everything goes, but armed resistance is legitimate within certain confines. And of course, all other forms of resistance are also legitimate, including nonviolent ones, which are hardly covered in the United States mainstream media over the years. And when they take place, of course, the response, like we saw in 2018, is vicious, even if the resistance is nonviolent. So how do we, what do we make of this? And, going back to the theme, what have we learned in the past year about the concept and perhaps practice of resistance?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I was of all these topics, and I'm really most interested in talking about in many ways. And honestly, we'll have in some ways more questions than answers. And I'm going to I want to kind of talk about it broadly because I want to sort of first start where you ended in terms of this question of resistance, especially armed resistance in Palestine and in the broader region. And I just think one of the lessons we really need to take, in a way, this feels obvious, and yet, as you say, is still controversial to say, I think, is that if it were not for the armed resistance in Gaza, if it were not for the armed resistance in Lebanon, if it were not for the armed resistance in Yemen, this genocide would be much worse than it has been. That it is really the resistance on the ground, which is the only thing that has come close to stopping Israel from what it has been attempting to do. And I just think that that needs to be recognized and reckoned with. And people in the United States might have their opinions about armed resistance, but that is, I feel after this last year, an undisputable fact, including armed resistance in the West Bank as well, which has really been one of the only ways that also Palestinians have been able to carve out pockets and areas of freedom throughout the West Bank. And so I think that's an incredibly important lesson. The place where I have some questions, and I'm going to define resistance broadly, because I actually want to talk about the movement in the US and the movement internationally and the resistance that we have seen here over this last year. Because I think in many ways, this is where we have more questions than answers. And I'll say this as somebody, and not to share your personal information, Bassam, but we first met close to 20 years ago. I've been working on these issues for about 25 years and involved in the Palestine movement throughout this time. And there's been many parts of this last year that have been extremely sort of humbling, and I will also just sort of say embarrassing, I would say, in my own naivety in terms of what I thought was possible. One of the things that I have felt especially naive about is, as someone who's been working on this issue for this long, is that not only did I not think we would be seeing things as horrible as what we're seeing in Palestine, but I feel a real sense of failure that we as a movement have not been able to build something strong enough to present a more formidable opposition to it here in the US. And I think as I think about resistance in the US and internationally, there's a real sense of failure in a way that I think of, that we have not been able to build a movement strong enough to impact this genocide more. But one of the other moments for me in this past year that is something that I'm still thinking about, but has been extremely influential on me as I've thought about this question since last October, and that I think raises some examples and questions that we really need to wrestle with as a movement, is I had a chance to go to South Africa in May for a conference, an anti-apartheid conference that took place there. And amongst the many things that I learned and was impacted by, one of them was the South African foreign minister giving a speech talking about their experience in defeating apartheid in South Africa and the lessons for the Palestine movement, both within Palestine and internationally. And one of the things that she really highlighted in that discussion was that in the South African model, there were really these four planks of the movement that were all separate, but without each of them, the movement would not have worked. And one of those planks was armed resistance, but that was just one plank. Another plank was these national mass movements. Another plank was international solidarity, which was like the BDS movement, the boycott movement of that time, and really what we're engaged in internationally. And those planks all work together. They were not necessarily coordinated, but they each did their job in terms of helping to defeat apartheid, both on the ground and internationally. And I think as we're at this year reflection point, I do think there are a lot of questions for us internationally and here in the US about what is our role? Where does the work here? What is the goal of our work in the US? And how is it part of a coordinated effort to defeat Zionism, as I said earlier, or at least end this genocide that we see playing out? I don't know where that thinking is taking place. I'd like to think some of it takes place on the pages of Mondoweiss. I'm sure some of it's taking place here at Jadaliyya, but it's as a movement, I do think we need to evaluate what we've been doing and what hasn't been working and what we need to be building so that we are pulling our weight in terms of this international effort that it's going to take through multiple different strategies and tactics.
What is it that can be used to approach and articulate this topic for those who see all manners of violence as, you know, I hate the word, but as terrorism or as a reflection of people's nature slash culture and so on? What do you use when somebody says, okay, but this is terrorism, without actually recognizing the context and the legality and so on? How do you respond? Just a quick question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I mean, I really will say, in terms of the taboo topics, especially in the United States, this is amongst the top. This idea of any type of armed resistance has been so um, villainized that there is, and then just like the term that you said that you don't like using, which exactly the term terrorism has become this catch-all for describing um, any kind of activity like this. I will say, one of the things that we did, which is a really useful, I have found, entry point for some of these questions, is we did a video. Amanda Weiss produced a video probably 2 years ago at this point, in Jenin in the West Bank. So this was before October 7th. This was, 2 years ago, but talking to young men in the Jenin refugee camp who are engaged in armed resistance, which honestly, what that means in their case is primarily self-defense and defending the camp from Israeli army incursions, and talking to them about why they made the decision to get involved. Like, why do they see it as being important for them? And part of what that video does, and part of, I guess, ultimately my answer to that question, is it really puts anybody in the position of what would you do if you were in this context, if you were in this environment where you had no control over the safety of your family and your loved ones, and you have seen your father, your uncle, your older brother get arbitrarily arrested and held indefinitely in Israeli prisons, and know that you are likely next. And you still might not, and this is the conversation I have with people, this still might not be the world that you want it to be. You still might not want to think that somebody should make this decision to take up a rifle to defend their community. But after hearing in those young people's own words why they made that decision, you can't help but understand it. And even there was this controversy just in this past day or so where the publisher of Haaretz is now in trouble over in Israel because he referred to the fighters in the Qassam brigades, or who are regularly regarded both in Israel and in the U.S. as terrorists. He referred to them as freedom fighters, and of course that's what they are. I mean, these are literally mostly young people who are fighting for the freedom of their people. But it really involves, I think, that perspective shift in trying to understand what are the conditions people are living under, what options do they have available to them, and what is the history? Like, you also recognize this long history, obviously, of nonviolent resistance, which exists and is the overwhelming form of resistance that Palestinians take. And yet, we are looking at over 75 years since the Nakba and the creation of the issues that we're still trying to deal with. So it's really the context, I believe, that is the way to answer that question, because overwhelmingly, once people become aware of that, even if it's not what they like or maybe what they would choose, you cannot help but understand the choice to engage in that type of resistance.
Thank you. I must say that it's not. It is true, of course, that people are not aware sometimes, but even when they become aware, and I've taught a class on discourses on terrorism and terrorism orientalism, and so even when people are aware that this is legally legitimate, there is an extra layer when it comes to the Arab world,
Yes.
to people from Muslim countries, and let's face it, a lot of people say Muslims. It's not really Muslims. I mean, it's almost in the overwhelming majority of cases concentrated in the Middle East. I mean, very few people are maligning Indonesian and Nigerian Muslims in general when it comes to this type of discourse. But yes, when it comes to the Middle East, there's an extra layer of culturalism and essentialism and reductionism and Orientalism that actually um, prevents what makes sense in other cases to actually apply to these people. These people, of course, the word "these" in quotation marks. So I just wanted to flag that there is this extra hurdle always, even when
I
it
agree.
came to democracy
I
and
agree. I think
authoritarianism.
we might get into that on our next term.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. This is gonna be unfortunately exciting in the problematic sense. I feel, regardless of the outcome, but there are degrees. Um, all right, thank you, Adam. Let's go to the next question, which is the West in quotation marks or Western values. What have we learned in the past year about the West slash Western values?
Now, this one is one that I've been especially interested in too, because I'll have to say, before this last year, again at Mondoweiss, I don't think we had ever run a story about the West or talking about people's reactions to the West. But again, in terms of these ideas that have been delegitimized in this past year, if we've gained clarity in this last year around what Zionism means, we've also gained clarity around this last year about what the West means and what it signifies. And um, to take a slight step back for a second, I mean, we've seen this from the beginning of the year, and these people making these comparing the West's reaction to what's happening in Gaza versus the West's reaction to what's happening in Ukraine. And I personally, as an editor, just can't, I don't like this double standard kind of story because it just honestly, it always just feels too obvious and just kind of like, well, of course there's a double standard. But one of the things that it led me to think is it's not a double standard. It is a single standard in terms of one of the things that we've learned about the West is that the West will use, promote, exercise, and forgive violence if done in the name of the West and in defense of the West, quote unquote, and its allies. And if you're in opposition to the West, then nearly anything is allowable. And that's what one of the things that we have seen in terms of both Europe, the US, fully supporting the Israeli genocide in Gaza, including using the institutions of the West to help carry that out. Institutions like the UN, World Court, and ICJ, and one of the International Court of Justice. And one of the things that's been very interesting, and I think perhaps one of the reasons that the South African case at the ICJ was so interesting is that it is this example of the global South, for lack of a better word, using the West tools against it. And it still remains to be seen how that case will be resolved. We've seen that there's an effort at the ICC to bring war crimes charges against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Those have not yet been delivered. So even the fact that these institutions are starting to buckle under a year of genocide and a year of global pressure and have still not buckled, I think really kind of shows their role more than anything. That anything that we have thought of as the West in terms of like liberal democratic values is really window dressing and tools that they use however they want to enforce this policy of global domination. And if you stand in the way of it or if you oppose it, then you will be in the firing line next, which is what we're seeing right now with what started in Gaza spreading to Lebanon, perhaps Iran, and other parts of the region.
Would you say that this particular war slash genocide has kind of surprised you a little bit in terms of the extent to which these Western values that are a pretense that is flowing out there by certain people who'd like to talk about them as a way of distinguishing it from the other. Did it surprise you the extent to which the duplicity has gone, even though we knew it existed? Or is this because I'll tell you very honestly, even though I am extremely critical, and I could say also cynical if I'm using the word correctly here, as in like I'm not buying, I never bought it because I know what's been happening in the world. But I think the degree to which we have seen this duplicity, especially in the United States and Germany, I mean, we could name other countries as well, actually made me realize that it's worse than I thought. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe I'm being naive.
Well, no, I have the same reaction, and I always feel slightly embarrassed because I think of myself similarly as someone who's critical and somewhat cynical, and yet I have found myself shocked too, and just sort of been like, "Gosh, well, what was I thinking?" Of course, but yeah, I mean, I do think this last year though has been um, a year that has really stress tested this situation. I think that like the I mean the way that say the Biden administration will be judged by history is yet to happen, but the loops through which the Biden administration, and again Germany is a great example. We've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in France, and throughout Europe, the justifications that the West has given for the genocide of the Palestinian people are absolutely criminal. And so, and shocking. I mean, we might joke amongst ourselves sort of about how craven they are, but to see Matthew Miller get up and talk at the State Department press conference and justify the killing of children has been absolutely disgusting. So yes, I mean, I would agree with you. In theory, we knew this, and watching it actually play out in practice has been shocking.
And that's saying a lot given what we have been saying, and many of us have been saying in writing. All right.
Yeah.
Their last topic and term is or idea is responsibility for this genocide. And the reason we included this is because clearly the Israeli state is carrying out this genocide. Um but and clearly the US is arming, funding, supporting at all levels, government, large swaths of society, media, corporate media, mainstream media, and a good portion of academia. Not I wouldn't say the majority, but definitely sizable. And then of course lobbies and a lot of the economically well-to-do corporations and firms that either benefit directly or indirectly, or I are supported by or staffed by people who simply support Israel, um, in relation actually to the question of capitalism, business, and so on. Now, in that sense, what is in your view? Of course, feel free to talk about the responsibility of this genocide. Who is responsible? But please address, if you can, a little bit the extent to which the U.S. is not responsible, because it has responsibility, of course, but the extent to which the U.S. sees itself in relation to what's happening. There are numerous, and I'm talking about more than dozens, actually, instances in which the spokespeople for the United States State Department and so on, whether it's Blinken, whether it is Miller, or what's the third person, the White House chief of staff, uh, all these folks
Yeah.
have actually said that yes, we do know that we support and we arm and we provide support, but they somehow break the link between that and what's happening. Uh, and they sometimes hide behind the rhetoric and discourse of ceasefire and all of that. So
Yeah.
how do U.S. Officials see their role, in addition to you speaking about responsibility for this genocide that we have learned about this past year?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question in terms of how does the U.S. see its role? Um, because I don't know, I don't fully know the answer to that question. I'm sure there are people that you described who see themselves as playing this really noble role in terms of perhaps trying to work towards an end of conflict. I think one of the things, and like when I was just talking about, and really this question kind of sums up almost each of our topics kind of put together here. Because this past year of genocide has been the responsibility for this genocide really lies in the Western establishment, of which the US is in a leadership role, obviously, of which Israel is an incredibly important part of which the EU and Europe is a part of. But within each of those places, and what the establishment is created by, are sort of all these institutions that you laid out. And we could see, and we could go through, if we had more time, all the ways that these institutions have each contributed their part. But one of the things that's been interesting in this way, and the way that this year has really provided as a stress test on this entire system, is that we've seen it in our universities. Hundreds of campuses around the country being overtaken by protests as students themselves were calling out their institutions' culpability and responsibility in the genocide. That's what those protests were against. We've also seen a whole part of the Palestine movement just focused on challenging the media, as you said. Organizations like Writers Against the War in Gaza, who have focused mainly on the New York Times as an establishment institution that played an incredibly important role in manufacturing the consent for this genocide and continues to today. I know there's also been a lot of attention on other news outlets like CNN. So each of these sectors of the establishment in the Western society has played their role in carrying out this genocide. So yes, of course, it has been Israel carrying out this genocide, and the military and political leaders of that country need to be held accountable. And we hope that they are. But so do the leaders of the United States who played a role. So do the leaders of Germany who played a role. So does the leaders of the New York Times and CNN and universities who have each played their role. And so when we talk about responsibility for the genocide and we talk about what we've learned from this past year, one of the things we've learned is seeing how these things fit together, how they work together, and if we're going to challenge it, how they need to be challenged together, which I do see, as critical as I was in some ways of things that were done and not done. I think as a movement and as a people who were outraged by what we've seen in this last year, I think that outrage has been directed in these proper places in terms of the institutions of the establishment, which is who really bears responsibility for the genocide.
Thank you, Adam. A very quick follow up. And I asked this, I think, of a couple of other people here and there. What do you think, or how long do you think it will be before we look back at what is happening now and have a sober perspective? And I'm not talking about you and me, because I think we're pretty sober as to what's happening right now, or most people actually, most humans who are watching. And we are seeing a lot of defections from the pro genocide camp, whether it is ordinary people or experts or what have you, including Zionists themselves. I mean, they're every other day. We see these reports and personal professions. When do you think we will look back at this moment and it'll be clear what happened, like even conventionally?
Yeah.
Sorry, this is this. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I'm hoping that you would give us some sense as to the criteria that would determine things.
Yeah. I mean, I think my answer, and this is actually a question that I've thought about quite a bit, and I think my answer might go in a different direction than what you're sort of anticipating or what you're hoping for or asking for. But just to say, and I'm going to speak a little personally in this regard. So, I mean, I don't know if you'd be part of my bio here or not, but or if it's also obvious, I don't know. I'm Jewish, and I've been part of my
What?
part of my engagement over this last year was watching the way that the Jewish community has engaged with this or has not engaged with this. I'm also 50 years old, and I will say, I think to answer your question, that we're going to be wrestling with this last year and trying to understand this last year and understand the repercussions of this last year for the rest of my life. And I think when I think about the work that needs to happen in the Jewish community, especially to understand what the Jewish community has stood by and celebrated and cheerleaded and promoted in terms of the genocide of this last year, I think of that and unpacking and atoning for that is going to be a generational project. Probably, I mean, it's before my time, but maybe similar to what the end of World War II was like for the perpetrators of the Nazi Holocaust and understanding what our society and what our community did, to both first even understand it and then to understand our role. Um, I think the similarity to the war in Iraq is really similar, and I would say that hasn't happened yet. That was 20 years ago, and we're thinking about all these kind of similarities and how this moment feels similar to that moment. But thinking about the U.S. society who helped carry out that horrible assault, I still think it's that history is largely unknown to most people in the United States, as well as everything that came out of that we're still impacted by because of what happened in 2003 and 2004. So I have no idea in terms of making a prediction of when this will happen, except that I do think what we've experienced over this last year is one of those similar to 2003 or 2001, these kind of historical pivots where nothing will be the same after than what was before. And our sort of unpacking and even an understanding. I mean, that's one of the things that we're all very aware of. And this comes down to even the casualty number in Gaza, which I know there's a lot of discussion around. But we have no idea. We have no idea how many tens or hundreds of thousands of people have even been killed. We have no idea the stories of what people have endured in Gaza over this last year. That is yet to come, as well as how this was carried out, who supported it, how they could have supported it, and how that will be rectified and accounted for. So I don't know. I actually really think this is going to be a large part of my life's work for probably the rest of my life.
And regarding casualties, we're not even considering the indirect
Yeah,
casualties, which we had a conversation at the Gaza and Context Project about specifically about that, and
yeah,
the Lancet report, which was actually misunderstood by some people to mean that right now, 186 people have been killed, and it's a projection, um, which by now, I mean, it could be
it's
actually much
even
closer
higher.
than we think.
But this is all connected to, I mean, what I said starting. Like, I think this is an extremely useful project. We've done something similar. Mondoweiss is kind of taking this year anniversary to reflect, but it's also clear we're still very much in the middle or maybe even the beginning of this moment, and it's really impossible to tell where it's headed.
I remember in 2002 when there were demonstrations against the potential launching of an invasion against Iraq, and I was part of the people who were both writing and speaking and protesting, and then we did it. Um, but there's something very interesting about that, and that is at that time, and I know we were very loud. no one felt unsafe. No one felt unsafe that they are loud saying that this is a criminal potential war, because the facts are just not there, and it's just criminal, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the connection to 9/11 is not there. The connection to Al Qaeda is not there. The WMDs are not there, which we ended up learning, because the supposed perpetrator was hiding in a hole, literally in a hole underground, um, and is not the kind of person that will forego using whatever weapons he had. Um, the point is that we didn't feel unsafe. Today, you actually feel unsafe. Depends on one's positionality. I mean, some of us are more vulnerable than others. People feel unsafe simply criticizing the genocide. All right. I kept you for too long, but it's your fault because it's been very insightful speaking with you. I'll let you leave us after you answer the last question, which is, where do you think we are headed? And you can answer this exactly in the way you answered some of the other questions. You can bring in personal and political and analytical together.
One thing this year has taught me, I would say, is that I have no idea where we're headed, because I never would have thought we would be here now talking in the scenario that we're talking in now. There's so many things that I saw in this last year that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. Um, and so it's really humbled me to refrain from making predictions. One thing I would say is I am, in terms of what I do feel more confident in being able to predict, this sort of domestic environment that you're describing, I do think will be getting much worse. And like you said, we're speaking on the eve of the presidential election. I think regardless of how that election goes, the repression that we're really just starting to see in the United States, I expect to get much worse over this next year, really aimed at anyone who is willing to speak with and stand on the side of Palestine.
Thank you, Adam. Who are you voting for? I'm joking.
I thought that was the last question. Sorry, sorry,
I'm,
connection
yeah.
going out.
I know. I'm just joking because you're not supposed to, especially in this country. I've learned. I've been here 40 years, but I've learned that this is a question that you don't ask. It's like how much money you're making,
Yeah,
whereas
yeah.
back home, it's the first thing you say, the first thing you ask. Who you're voting for or what have you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Adam. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. This was on the longer side, and I'm glad we did it. Thank you for giving us the time, and I hope we continue speaking again. And I really took some notes about some things that came up that I would like to revisit, maybe in a broader conversation format with other folks.
I would love that. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Habibi. Take care of yourself.
Bye.
Bye.